Welcome to Every Horror Movie on Netflix, the show where we watch, discuss, and review every horror movie on Netflix. I'm Steve, and I'm here with Patrick.
Hello.
And Chris.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Hope you guys brought your Daisy Dukes because we are reviewing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre this week.
My shorts are riding right up my butt. Thank you very much.
Glad I can't see below the table. Before we get into it, what have you guys been up to?
It's been a busy week, man. You know, primaries, Super Bowl. Chris, how are you feeling about the results of the primaries?
I'm very happy. Bernie won Iowa big time, and the Titans won the Super Bowl. It's just been a beautiful week for all our lovable underdogs.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Titans are an underdog this season, or if they were.
I mean,
they used to be.
You've probably gotten the idea at this point, unless Chris just went.
Unless I'm Nostradamus.
Did an amazing job on those predictions that we recorded this a little bit in advance.
Yeah, that's why I still sound like shit. Sorry. I don't know what. Yeah.
We're here for you.
Yeah.
We're pumping him full of, I was going to say salt water, but I don't think that's a thing. Or no, that is supposed to be good for your throat.
I've been trying everything, but
like a neti pot sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
But the good news is, this week we're talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So if I need to clear my throat, I'm just going to pretend I'm making a chainsaw noise.
I was going to say, you definitely have kind of the gravelly sound of a chainsaw engine.
Yeah.
Can you demonstrate? Okay. Yeah.
That's pretty much all my vocal cords are up to the task to do this episode. So
You sound great, honestly.
Thank you.
But yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, Steven, why did you pick this?
Actually, for a multitude of reasons. One, we haven't really done a film that's considered a classic on the podcast in a while, and I thought it'd be a nice break for us. A break from all the joking and jiving that we usually do, and get a little more serious, maybe. We'll see. Reason number two, Chris had never seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Gasp. What?
That's true. I'm a bad horror fan. This was my very first time.
Gonna put you in horror jail.
Yeah.
Have you seen any of the shitty remakes or the sequels?
No.
The prequels?
No.
The squeakquels?
No.
Okay.
And this is, Stephen, I think you're on record saying that this is your favorite horror movie of all time.
Yeah, it is. It's not a film that that I really get the urge to revisit very often because it is quite a powerful beast in my opinion. I named my cat after director Tobe Hooper, who died in 2017. I know. I'm sure our fans are aware of that, but another reason, I needed another reason to plug Tobe on the show.
Bless.
And, this was really, I think, there were probably others, but this is the clearest memory I have, of being a young person, a pre-teenager, 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there, and being really fucked up by a movie. I don't know if it was IFC or the Sundance Channel, but I was starting to become a horror fan. My best friend was he would say the name Tobe Hooper all the time, and now I look back and I'm like, wow, he's not really a guy that you would think of as a horror auteur back in that time. I think that came later. But I just felt it's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I was into cult movies. How can you not want to see that? It's such a lurid title. It's so suggestive. It conjures mental images immediately. And I saw it was going to be on a school night at 11 o'clock on Sundance or IFC. So I stayed up after everyone else in the house went to bed and just sat in an armchair and watched it by myself with all the lights off. But the version they ran was a version with director commentary.
Oh, that's odd.
But I was determined. I thought, I'm just going to stay up and watch this thing and see. I think I can handle this. So I turned the volume almost all the way off, and I was hypnotized. The images were so striking and so startling that watching the film without sound, it still works. You know exactly what's going on. It's just as terrifying, even without the really cool, innovative sound effects that are in it. And it left a mark on me. Well worth staying up and being groggy for the next day of middle school to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if it's my favorite horror movie, but it's certainly one of my favorite horror movies of all time. And it's actually funny, a few episodes ago, I was unable to join y'all, and it was Steven's turn to pick the movie that episode, and it was briefly rumored that you were going to pick this movie, and I was like, nah, I want to be on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
No, stay off of
I'm
it.
not,
Don't read the
I'm not
comments.
missing that shit. So I'm delighted that we got a chance to watch it together.
Yeah, so Patrick, you had seen it before.
Oh yeah, a few times.
What kind of a mark did it leave on you, if any?
I mean, it's, what can you say? It's one of the most visceral and weird horror movies of all time. And the thing that really struck me now watching it, at least the third, I know I've watched it at least twice before this viewing. Mm-hmm. So now having watched it for at least the third time, it just still is like, huh. Like, I mean, it's still a fucking ride, even when you know what's coming. And it's still horrific and oddly funny sometimes. And
yeah, a lot of dark humor in there.
It holds up. It's not just like you watch it in 2020 and it holds up from 1970 something.
4, I think.
Yeah, to 2020. But also it like continues to hold up even watching it again and again.
It's really surprising. It was still surprising to me because I don't know, this was like a proto slasher, and so many films like a lot of the slasher rules came from like this and Psycho and Halloween and Black Christmas. But so it's like hard for me, even though I know what happens in this movie, it's still hard for me to like watch it expecting certain things to happen. Like there's one scene where I expect 2 characters to go off in the woods and fuck. And no, they're going to look for gas. Like this movie is like it's not interested in that. And it, so it's just kind of fun that like even all these years later, it's still kind of surprising. It's still doing things that I've not really seen replicate in other films. But before we really get into it, I do want to mention I had a number of ways to watch this movie. So it's but for the podcast, revisiting this time around. So I have the Blu-ray. It's on Netflix. And on the Blu-ray, there are several different commentary tracks. And I thought, you know what? I want to see if this is the same commentary track with Tobe Hooper that I heard when I was 11, 12 years old. Mm-hmm. It was not. It was new. They did a 4K restoration of it. But just full disclosure, I watched this movie again for the first time in a couple of years with the commentary on and the main sound, kind of the volume lowered on that as it is on commentary tracks. I still had to turn it off at about the 30-minute mark because I was too creeped out and started again the next night.
Nice.
Such is the power of this movie for me, but should we set it up? I mean...
Well, I feel like... So you and I have both kind of given our background with it. I feel like we should hear at least the initial, like the base impression from the man who saw it for the first time, Chris.
Yeah. Let's talk about the premise, though, just the 35,000-foot view.
Sure.
Yeah, so
fuck your first impression. We don't want to hear it.
The plot of this movie is pretty simple. Obviously, it takes place somewhere in Texas. I'm not sure exactly where.
I think it was paid for by the Tourism Bureau.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everyone knows the premise of this movie, though. Like, it's a bunch of fucking high school kids who get stalked by Leatherface, and everybody knows who Leatherface is.
I did not know the premise.
Really?
I mean, I knew Leatherface, but I didn't know what circumstances would bring these kids to Leatherface.
Yeah, so what happens is, I think, it's unclear in the film, but my impression is they're coming back from a road trip back through Texas. There's been some grave robbing going on in this Texas town, and I mean, one of the earliest shots is like this horrifying, couple of corpses perched atop of a giant tombstone. And
one of my
Texas sun, you can almost smell the flesh boiling in the sun.
One of my favorite opening shots of all. Well, and it's not an opening shot. There are shots before that, but I think of it as the opening shot because it's just it lasts so long and just burns itself into your memory because it's so horrifying, simple, but yeah, like you said, like you can feel the heat, you can feel the dust, you can feel the grossness and the fucking rotting flesh, and I just never will forget that shot.
So there's this grave robbing going on in this town. It's being widely reported in the news, rumored about around town. As these kids are coming back, one of them decides they should check in on their deceased grandfather, I think,
yeah,
just to make sure that his corpse hasn't been stolen by this maniac that's on the loose. They stop to get gas at a gas station that doesn't have gas, and actually there was a gas shortage around this time in the U.S. That was a pretty big deal back then. They get some barbecue meat from for the proprietor of the gas station, and they eventually happen upon a really terrifying house. They're out of fuel, and madness and terror ensue from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was on board. I this movie really drew me in, and I found myself immersed and impressed by the mood and the horror of the images that it was presenting to me. And really shocked that for a movie as old as it is, it could still be as visually unsettling and just with such a palpable sense of dread. Mm-hmm. I mean, starting with the opening monologue, the little like exploitation film thing where it's like, let me tell you about the murders of these kids. It was called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just kind of, without that, like, you might be bored, but all hell's about to break loose. So yeah, I mean, this movie I thought was horrifying for at least the first hour or so. I'll tell you, I think once Leatherface starts doing his thing, there's some choices that kind of reduce the horror for me, but then there's some things that escalate the horror. So I don't know, but it was a good romp, a fun romp.
For a movie that, I mean, as far as I know from everything I've read about it over the years, I mean, this was like a kind of a slapdash for cash sort of situation where Tobe Hooper had made something like 60 documentaries, 2 feature films that were very low budget sort of student films.
Wait, did you say 60 documentaries?
Yeah. Probably short subjects or whatever.
Wow, okay.
These are his words from this commentary I just watched, and he sounded sincere, but he's been known to kind of bend the truth a little bit.
But he's a young man at this time. I mean, he's like younger than us, right? He's like 20-something.
This movie has young director energy.
Yeah.
For better and for worse.
And it's a 46-year-old movie now, so would have to be, unless he's like really fucking old now.
Well, he made a lot of short subject or whatever. He had experience making films, playing around with film. I've seen one of his early experimental shorts, and it's pretty out there, almost unwatchable, I would say. But he wanted to, move to Hollywood and get the money to make this movie in Texas and really make a splash. I mean, he did, but Chris is right. It has that big director energy. It takes a lot of swings, but so much of what happens in this movie, I've learned over the past few years, is like kind of incidental. It's sort of like Night of the Living Dead is the other probably most talked about low budget, innovative, monumental horror classic. And, people talk about it as being about like civil rights. Well, the lead actor in Night of the Living Dead was chosen because he was the best actor who auditioned for the role, and yet it takes on this importance like in the cultural long view. And I think this movie really kind of fits into that sphere as well, where a lot of things that happen in it are kind of mistakes. I think it was like Tobe Hooper was a politically charged guy, but it's a film that like seems to have a lot of themes about consumerism, especially, and there's some stuff that seems to be linked to the Vietnam War, but I don't know how intentional it really was.
Okay.
Well, I learned that Tobe Hooper has apparently said that this movie is about meat. Like, it's about meat. It's about like vegetarianism and factory farming.
Yeah, so obviously that really interested me as a vegetarian.
Yeah.
And it was explicit. I mean, it's explicit early on. And I thought it was making some pretty bold choices in how it, juxtaposed all the images of the cattle and the descriptions of cattle being killed with eventually what happens to these kids.
Well, we should probably explain, like, early on, they're driving through the countryside. They drive past a slaughterhouse, and one of them is, like, sort of monologuing about factory farming and how they shoot cattle or something like that.
And there seems to be a through line, which is a common sentiment in the animal rights community, that, how we treat animals is indicative of how we treat ourselves.
Yeah.
And the way that basically these teenagers become prey to people who seemingly have just a complete derangement and desensitization to violence that was maybe given to them by working inside a factory slaughterhouse.
Exactly.
Very interesting to me. And then combined with what I was sensed as maybe a Vietnam allegory too. Putting all those three together.
That part was incidental. The Vietnam thing, I think, was just like a product of like the collective subconscious at the time. I mean, it's in a lot of movies. I mean, people made the argument that Star Wars is a Vietnam movie.
Yeah.
And I think that here it's about as thin, but I mean, there are shades of it, and they're in the performances and in some of the details. Like, it's there. It's like you can't make a movie in 1974 in, rural Texas and have it not feel like it has something to say about it.
Right. So I told you, Stephen, I haven't read any critical analysis of this movie at all. I'm a babe in the woods. the things that said Vietnam to me were, there's the one throwaway line where the girl's reading her horoscope book and she talks about how the universe is out of alignment and there's bad things happening to you personally and also in the world or something like that. So I'm like, okay, so this is a movie made at the height of Vietnam and we're talking about bad things happening in the world.
Oh, it's as relevant as ever.
And then you have, these kind of like hippie type kids, and there's the part where like the camera lingers on the girl looking at like the bloody handprint on the back of the van. Like, here's some kids off on a little holiday, fun and fancy free, but their hippie van has blood on it, literally. And, and then also the fact that the weird hitchhiker they pick up takes a picture of these kids and burns it with gunpowder in front of them. And that he uses gunpowder.
Choice. Yeah.
And then at the end, I mean, I won't go into too much spoilers, but our remaining victim makes an appeal to the guy who seems to be running the whole show. And it's like, you could stop all this. You could stop all this if you just wanted to. And that sounded like a very Vietnam line of dialogue to me.
Interesting. I like this.
Yeah.
Well,
I
I think it also has shades of Vietnam, and it could just be because of the budget. Though I think this film was shot in a pretty intentional way to look grimy and gritty. But, Vietnam was the first televised war. And we have a lot of films from this era, and I think this one is maybe the most effective. It just probably looked to viewers seeing this on the big screen at the time like very similar to what it was like to see, television footage from Vietnam in their homes. This movie has like a lot of kind of, the camera moves a lot. Everything looks kind of gritty and sort of like, just like more like hyper realistic than I think I would feel people would be used to in a film in that era.
It was super cheaply made.
Guerrilla style almost.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's as much a product of necessity as it is artistic choice. And I do think this is it feels weird to say beautifully shot, but
it is
skillfully, very, very skillfully shot movie and very visually effective movie. I was just thinking about, it takes a good, 30, 45 minutes to even fucking see Leatherface for any of the real, like, serial killer shit to start going down. But there is so much that is just unsettling and horrifying throughout the first half of this movie. So often with these movies, there'll just be that, especially with these kind of movies, you have just that real dull, deadly, sometimes half hour of setup where it's like, all these characters are fucking stupid. They're all going to die, just cut to the chase. But there's some real unsettling stuff. Chris mentioned the hitchhiker scene. They pick up this guy on the side of the road who later ends up having more significance to the plot. But that's a real tense, uncomfortable scene long before even he is like cutting himself and lighting a picture on fire. Like, it's just the unease in the car.
As soon as he gets palpable. In the van, you're like, oh, why did you pick this guy up? I don't remember like why I had that initial impression, but like so many things in this film, I just felt like I was unsafe watching it. I felt like not only the way it was written and acted, but the way it was directed just made me feel like this is helmed by a maniac who is disregarding all the rules of cinema. And just like one look at that character and the way that he's framed in this van, he seems to take up so much space in this van where other characters are like struggling to breathe.
Right. I think he's on one end of the van on his own and everybody else is like in a separate
There's
shot.
There's like 4 or 5 people in this van.
It's like this fucking unhinged guy just immediately dominates the screen. And as a viewer, I'm just like, oh God, like get me out of here.
The slaughterhouse scene too is really effective. I mean, you don't see a fucking cow get shot. You don't see anything particularly gruesome, but something about the way it's shot is really disconcerting and alarming.
What slaughterhouse scene?
When they're talking about the slaughterhouses and they show the
just
scenes
the kind of stock footage,
Yeah, I mean,
it's not stock. It's not stock footage because they do think there are some close-ups and things that just it's unsettling
of the cows. Yeah, while they're as they're driving past the slaughterhouse and talking about like how slaughterhouses work, just it's unsettling.
So all of that was so good that when we get to Leatherface about 45 minutes or an hour in, my imagination has been fucking with me so much for the first hour of this movie and freaking me out that when we get to Leatherface and chasing people and screaming and chainsaws, it just didn't really pay off. Now, I mean, that's the problem with a lot of horror movies.
Sure.
You know,
Once you see the boogeyman and you're in the boogeyman's world, it's often not as frightening.
Right.
You can see the seams.
Right. So I don't know if there's a solution. I'm not going to hold it against the movie, but
there's some chilling stuff in there, though. I mean, number one, we have to talk about the introduction of Leatherface, which is, I mean, first of all, we're in broad daylight. We're in Midsommar territory here, 50 years ahead of that. We're in broad daylight. We're entering this house and we see, God, it chills me just to think about it. This small doorway next to the stairs with this red wall with animal skulls on it, and a little ramp like you'd see in a slaughterhouse to help the cow get up into the wherever they're gonna slaughter it. And Leatherface just comes out of fucking nowhere, whacks the guy in the head with a hammer, very realistically whacks the guy in the head with a hammer, and it looks very realistic, and then slams the door shut. I mean, this happens in the span of like 15 seconds. This has been not a slow movie, but a movie that doesn't have any big scares or big thrills in it. Well, and suddenly we're blindsided and we're in uncharted territory for the rest of this thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting the build up to that too, because these two, the two young lovebirds have been kind of like running around. They're at what's her name? The protagonist, not Nancy. Why am I saying Nancy? Sally. Yeah, Sally. They're at Sally's grandpa's house, and they go next door looking for gas, right? I think.
Yeah, the hair generator.
Yeah, and they're like, exploring around the house, and he's knocking on the door. No one's answering. He goes in, and I don't know. I remember being shocked by Leatherface's appearance the first time I saw it. It just doesn't build up to it in the way you normally would the reveal of that character.
Yeah.
And it's 1,000 times more shocking. It's also filmed in like a fairly wide shot too. It just seems so commonplace, he just steps out, clocks him on the head, and drags him away. And it's just like, holy shit, what?
He slams the door, and apparently that door was a last minute addition. Like on the day of shooting, Tobe Hooper decided like, we need a door like you'd have at a slaughterhouse, like a big metal door. And that makes it even more terrifying because it's like, I don't know, just him slamming that shut, and there's a whole other horrifying world behind that door.
Right.
You don't want to know what it looks like. You don't want to go deeper into this house. And you're almost like, I was almost like thankful for that abrupt barrier being pulled back.
I think it feels so shocking because you see that door, you see that there's obviously something weird down there. And I think most other movies would have that character wander all the way down into the basement and see all the weird shit. And you're like, don't go in the basement. Why are you going in the basement? Why are you looking at all the weird shit? Get out of the house. But no, he doesn't even go down there. And boom, like it's so far ahead of when you're expecting that to happen. It happens. And it's just like, what?
You're completely blindsided by it.
Yeah.
Love it. Fucking terrifying.
That was
even
good.
The stuff with him, I mean, like even the chase scenes in the woods, I love. It seems like he's using a telephoto lens. So you're constantly like, it's like dream logic where like Leatherface appear, like objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And like, you don't know, like what's the distance between Sally and Leatherface? Like what's, it just feels like I've had nightmares like that where I'm being pursued and like, I don't know if the killer is 2 inches behind me or 20 yards.
Those chase scenes do go on for forever when Sally goes over to the other house, if I remember correctly, looking for the other two, and then is running back to her grandpa's house to get away from Leatherface with the chainsaw. And as I was watching them, I was like, all right, this is getting kind of tedious. Like they've been running forever. There's a lot of chainsaw noise. But what struck me about that is it almost works. It works in like a cinema verite kind of way where like Sally makes mostly smart decisions. Like she gets the fuck out of the house as soon as she sees Leatherface. And it's kind of just in real time, like her getting back to the other house. And
yeah, that whole final act it does seem to happen in real time. You're right.
Yeah. And it feels, real because of that. So while on one hand I was like, this is dragging, I was also like, no, this feels really real and adds to the general just like grit of the movie, I guess.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone watching this in 1974. And where maybe that's just, it's like 10 years ago they were getting spooked by the train coming into the station on the screen, to see this.
Well, I mean, the violence in this was widely decried. And I mean, it's still, a horrifyingly violent movie, but I think it was
talk about that.
I think it was even more horrifyingly violent at the time. We got to talk about what?
We got to talk about the violence in this movie at some point. I don't know if we want to wait until we get into the spoiler room, but it's the violence is handled very interestingly in this film. And it's very interestingly shot.
I mean, we haven't talked about the meat hook scene, which I think is not quite spoiler territory. Well, so maybe we could talk about that.
Really, I mean, we've kind of given the whole sort of broad scope of the movie, and we know there's a final girl who survives. You can probably even guess by listening to us talk about this who that is, since this is one of the films that sort of set up that archetype. But yeah, I mean, Tobe Hooper apparently, while he was editing this film, and I've heard this from multiple sources, so this doesn't sound like something he made up, which is pretty common to come across that sort of thing, depending on how stoned he is during interviews. And apparently he had a number for the MPAA, and he would call them as he was editing the film, and he initially knew he wanted an R rating, but he was interested to see, like, what would it take to make this horrific film and turn it into a PG movie. And he would call them and say, like, okay, well, I got a scene where we hang a girl on a meat hook. And they would say, well, that's an R. And he would say, but what if you don't see the hook go in? And then he showed them the footage, and they were like, actually, that's the least violent meat hook hanging scene we could possibly imagine. Like, we would give you a PG for that scene, which is fucking insane. But there's a lot of that in this movie. Like, this is a mostly bloodless horror film. In fact, one of the only times
blood is different from violence. Like, it's still a horrifying thing to see. I mean, the meat hook scene is horrifying. It doesn't pull any punches. Yeah,
you feel it in your spine. But when I've seen it so many times now that, like, and every time it still shocks me. But every time I've never done like the frame by frame, and I would like to, but every time I'm like, oh, I see the trick. Like, I see how they did that and made it so effective without showing anything. You see the hook, and then you see her being hung in a harness, and that's it. It's two really quick shots, and yet it works. That's genius, in my opinion. And there's a lot of that going on in this movie, where there's the suggestion of violence. A character is beheaded. All you see is Leatherface. You see the body, but you don't even see the head. And then you see Leatherface move a chainsaw down, and it seems to grind on something, but you don't see what it is. And then you never see the head, but you know that someone was just decapitated.
Yeah. And again, some of it is just horrifying and violent, has the feeling of violence to it because it's so pedestrian. The meat hook thing, again, is just, he picks her up. There's not like a lot of build up to it. There's not like, Tobe Hooper's not trying to show you a gusher of blood and not trying, he's not trying to do to go back to our Terrifier episode. He's not trying to have look at that kind of moment.
That's a great thing, because that's the exact opposite of what he does here. Here, it feels like he's more interested in the metaphor than the act of violence. He's more interested in the human image being, synonymous with cattle than he is at, the titillation of the gore.
And also, it's a better metaphor because the horror of the slaughterhouse industry and the horror of what happens in this movie is how routine it is.
Yeah. Well, the hitchhiker says something early on when they pick him up and they're talking, because he had worked in a slaughterhouse, like all the family.
Oh, that's right. He's the one who explains how the slaughterhouse works.
And he talks about how, one of them's like, oh, it's disgusting the way they kill them with that gun. He's like, no, man, you don't use that gun. That's not good. You got to use a hammer. Hammer's better. He doesn't explain why. It's just because he's like so desensitized to violence that he needed that like extra thrill of being like more responsible for the kill.
Or maybe the hammer is better if you have no concern for a clean kill.
Yeah. And no concern for like it's not ethical either way, but I think it's slightly more ethical to use the gun because it does kill them instantaneously. And they assumingly if it's done right, don't feel much pain.
The gun, I think, stuns. I think that's the point.
Oh, you're right. It stuns, and then they cut the throat.
Yeah, they cut the throat, and the throat's what kills them in real life.
Well, it seems that the hitchhiker enjoys the cruelty as well. Like, that's part of the appeal of the hammer.
And then later, there's the character who says, never enjoyed killing or something like that. Like, I forget what the line is, but the elder of the family indicates that killing's not something to be enjoyed. It's something that you got to do. And so if there's any mystery and there's any real spooks, and we'll talk more about all that, I'm sure, in a moment when we go to the spoiler room, as much as they maybe overexpose Leatherface, in my opinion, in the movie, they do really hold back on what these people's intentions are and what they're doing with all these dead bodies.
Yeah. Well, my theory is, you know what? Let's save that for the spoiler room, actually.
Okay. Yeah,
I want interesting topic to get into.
I want to discuss more your thoughts on the over-exposition of Leatherface, because I almost feel like they undersell him, but I think it's better discussed in the spoiler room. So maybe we should just review it at this point.
Yeah, I think we've pontificated enough about this thing. Let's go down to the spoiler room, but before we do so, you know what we got to do? We got to review it. I'd like to go with Chris first, since he's never seen this film before. Chris, would you view it, cue it, or screw it, or barbecue it?
I don't want to piss anybody off, but I think I'm going to give it a cue it.
All right. Hot take. Hot take.
Yeah, part of that's because I'm a contrarian asshole, but part of it is as much as I thought this movie did a lot of stuff right, the last hour is just a little too much screaming and writhing, and the horror really takes a back seat to me. It kind of just becomes exploitation, not that interesting. Fuck, I don't know. It's still worth a fucking watch. All right, I'll give it a view it.
All right.
Oh, wow. That was a roller coaster.
Yeah.
You just went full Patrick on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it held my attention for sure. There were parts where I was like, okay, what's going on here? But the fact that it gets as depraved and sensational and maybe titillating as it does, yet still seems to offer up all these interesting thematic threads that we're talking about, that's an achievement. And again, as watching this in the year 2020, it's one of those things where, like, everything this movie did, we've seen imitated 40 times. Mm-hmm. So it's not gonna kick like it maybe did originally. But
yeah, I mean, this was fucking pre-Halloween. This was pre-Black Christmas, I think. Right? Yeah. So it's the granddaddy of that shit.
I'll give it a view it.
Well, Patrick tends to be the wild card, so we'll save him for last, I think. I mean, I'm going to give it a view it, but I think it's just a film. If you're interested in horror, I feel like, you just have to see it at some point. I don't think it's like a prerequisite to enjoying any other slasher, but get around to it at some point. If it's been sitting on your shelf, it's worth watching. It's worth thinking about. It's worth reading about, worth discussing. That said, I do have to say my one sort of caveat, the one thing that I am kind of on the fence about this film is I do feel like there is a lot of just shrieking and shrillness and nonsense in this film where I'm like, I can never tell every time I watch it, am I feeling anxious right now because I'm annoyed by the performances and how long the scene is going on, or am I feeling anxious because this is actually making me feel a sort of dread for the characters on screen? I can never really figure it out. There's definitely one scene in particular that I wish hadn't lasted as long that we'll get into in the spoiler room. But it's a movie that feels like it was made by a madman. Totally effective as far as developing a unique and terrifying mood, showing us, one of the most iconic killers ever created. It's worth it. That's worth the price of admission alone for me. So view it, Patrick.
Well, first of all, I will say I give an absolute view it to my reputation as the wild card. I endorse that wholeheartedly. But as for the film, view it. Obviously, view it with prejudice. One of the greatest horror movies of all time. One of my favorite horror movies. I hear what you guys are saying about the shrieking and the screaming. It certainly does great, but it feels like a genuine ordeal. It just contributes to this feeling that you're watching something horrifyingly real. There's no escape from it for you or for the protagonist. I think that it is effectively done. I mean, if you or anyone else was in that situation, you'd probably be screaming for fucking 45 minutes straight too. It feels real and weird and unlike any movie I've seen. It's great. Go see it. Why haven't you seen it already? Fucking asshole. Go watch it. Also, I don't think you're a fucking asshole. Thank you so much for listening to every horror movie on Netflix.
All right. Well, if your Daisy Dukes are riding up, it's time to pull them back down.
Yeah, I've been debating whether I want to downgrade back to a Qit, but I guess we'll go to the spoiler room first.
Yeah, we can hash it out there.
You have to decide now.
I know.
Once we go to the spoiler room, it's done. It's sealed. We notarize it, and we send it off to
what I meant.
The gnomes who run the website.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant. I realized that my window to change my rating is shrinking. So
yeah. Chris loves to game the average a little bit, which doesn't exist. There is no average of our rating, but he loves to game it.
Here's the thing. The only argument I can make for a Qit is because of the historical time that we live in, where basically if you listen to this conversation and you know the broad strokes of the story, I'm not sure if watching it's really going to make a big difference in your life. I don't know if I'm going to watch it again or really show it to anybody, but that, in its time, great film. So
I feel like the View It is standing, and I feel like we should hurry down to the spoiler room before he overthinks it anymore.
Let's head down there, Chris. Make sure to pull the slaughterhouse door shut behind you and lock it tight.
Yeah.
We'll see you all in a few moments.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome back to Every Horror Movie on Netflix. We're down here in the spoiler room, and looks like Greg's done some redecorating. I don't know where he got all those animal carcasses from. Got a little love seat here made out of what looks to be maybe a cow and a fox. And
mating.
Yeah. Ooh.
He's been picking up some shifts at the slaughterhouse.
There's a lot of chicken feathers on the floor. I don't know why he thought that would look decorative, but it's kind of disgusting. I think we're going to have to get a new vacuum to clean all that shit. So we've been talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the classic, the nearly unassailable film by Tobe Hooper. One thing I wanted to talk about up above, and it just didn't feel appropriate, is my kind of theory. I don't know if it's mine. I don't know where it came from. I don't even know if it makes sense.
It's a theory.
But, this movie made me think a lot about Dawn of the Dead and about consumerism. I think, and I don't know how intentional this was, but we've got, one, Tobe Hooper has said, as Patrick mentioned, that this movie's about meat, and that can mean a number of things. But I think in some ways it can be read to be about consumerism. I mean, one, this family, Leatherface's family, they've kind of built their own little tiny economy. So they not only do they rob graves of the recently buried and process the meat and sell it in their gas station that never seems to have gas. So if you stop there, you're even more likely to get stuck by their house and be murdered and turned into meat that will then be sold to other tourists passing by. But yeah, they murder those tourists as well. And it's kind of this like self-sustaining cycle of a desensitized violence and madness and murder and mental illness going on. I mean, it's kind of a sweet deal.
It's an intentional community, they say.
The currency in this community is meat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, now that we're down the spoiler room, I guess we should hit on the key bullet points, which is that the gas station owner is part of Leatherface's family, ostensibly Leatherface's dad or surrogate father or something. The hitchhiker who was picked up on the side of the road is also part of the cannibal hillbilly psycho family. And yeah, there's this lengthy sequence that plays out, a dinner table sequence, I guess, is our main sort of spoiler in the spoiler room.
Main entree.
Yeah, where Sally is the main entree. Oh, and also Grandpa. We can't forget Grandpa.
Can't forget Grandpa.
Horrifying old Grandpa.
Grandpa. Okay, just when I was starting to get tired of all the hijinks and the screaming and the running, Grandpa brought this movie back for me.
And this is where, we're in,
What a moment.
Severe black comedy territory. And it didn't register to me that way when I would watch this movie as a younger person. Now I'm like, this is fucking hilarious. Back then I'm like, oh God,
I don't
just fucking
know.
kill her already. I'm tired of seeing you drop the fucking hammer.
Oh yeah, that part.
Yeah.
That part. Well, but I mean,
It's so hard. Like, there's so many things you can read multiple ways in this.
But our hero runs into the house and she's fleeing Leatherface and goes upstairs and thinks she sees people. Oh, she doesn't even know it's Leatherface's house at that point, right?
She doesn't know what happened.
She was attacked by Leatherface in the woods, and she runs to the nearest house, which happens to be Leatherface's
She
house.
didn't know that all of her friends have died in there.
Yeah, talk about out of the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah.
If you
My
wanna
favorite
continue
chapter
the meat
in The
analogy.
Hobbit, actually.
Yeah. So she goes up there and she sees a couple people chilling like in the second floor, and she seems to think they're living people, but they look like they're just corpses, like they're grave robbed corpses. There's an old man and an old woman, practically like mummified. And then later, and I mean, I don't know, I'm explaining this for the two people who haven't seen the movie, I guess, but later she gets captured and brought to the family dinner, and they wheel this mummified looking fucking corpse down the stairs in like a rocking chair, and then it's the grandpa.
He's the patriarch of the family.
And then they cut our hero's finger, and grandpa's actually barely alive and like starts sucking the blood out of her finger.
Nasty.
It's horrifying.
So nasty.
And also hilarious.
Yeah.
And then later, because grandpa used to work in the slaughterhouse in the good old days, they're trying to kill her with a hammer, but he like can't hold the hammer.
And that's like clearly, it's kind of like, oh, Leatherface brought home a girlfriend. It's like really fucking funny. Guess who's coming to dinner?
And to speak to both Stephen's point about sort of the economy or the community created by these characters, and sort of the overall theme we've been discussing about the sort of thin line between black comedy and horror in this. Like, obviously, it's been noted by many people the way this dinner table scene seems to sort of parody the nuclear American family, with grandpa as the grandpa, and the gas station owner as the dad, who's like bitching out the hitchhiker kid for like being a shithead all the time. And then Sally is, the guess who's coming to dinner sort of girlfriend. And on that level, as black comedy and as parody of, the American family, it's pretty fucking funny. But at the same time, Sally is horrified and screaming, and it's really unsettling. And I guess my overall point is it works as both. Like, I'm watching that scene and I'm both chuckling at it as that parody, and also like, holy shit, this is just an intense ordeal portrayed at length on screen.
And it's really a new take on horror comedy. Because we've talked about horror comedy before, and I always think it's funny when you have horror stuff played with a straight face or whatever, campy stuff. We also talk about horror comedies that are like comedies like Shaun of the Dead, where there's a horror element, but to have something be simultaneously terrifying and also hilarious, what a feat.
It's really rare, and this pulls it off. I will say, if you want to see that scene for an entire movie going completely off the rails with Dennis Hopper, you have to watch Tobe Hooper's sequel to this, which is I recommend seeing it once if you found this film at all intriguing.
I haven't. I really need to see that.
It really goes like balls to the wall Gonzo with the humor in a kind of delightful way, I think.
That's such an interesting point about the horror comedy, because so often we get upset with horror comedies for undercutting the horror, or for the basic conceit being, hey, how horror movies work, like watch this thing that is a horror movie, but we're just constantly calling attention to the fact that we're parodying horror conventions, and there's nothing fucking scary about it. Maybe there's some gore, but there's nothing unsettling truly about it. And this is such an effective, true combination of those two things.
Because it's playing to something that was like probably just beginning to be, maybe had long been socially relevant, like the breakdown of the nuclear family. So like there's some inherent humor in seeing like this fucked up group of maniacs that still like identify with each other as family, and they have this like very traditional family structure.
And they operate. Yeah, it's not even a dysfunctional family, really. I mean, a little bit.
As functional as any, I guess.
Yeah, and that, we've talked about the hammer scene where the family insists that Grandpa is going to be the one to make the kill on Sally, and he's going to do it with the hammer. Grandpa is the best at this. It's repeatedly noted that Grandpa is like the king of killing shit with the hammer, and Grandpa is so fucking feeble, he keeps dropping the hammer every time he tries to kill Sally. And Jesus Christ, how many times does he drop that fucking hammer?
It goes on for seemingly forever.
And it is perfectly straddling that line because Sally is rightfully horrified. It makes sense that this old fuck wouldn't be able to hold this hammer, but at the same time, it is oddly funny that it just keeps going on and on, and your brain doesn't know how to process it.
It's so weird. It's so off the wall. I mean, it should be noted that,
and you see it hit her head at one point, and like the chunk of like skull or like flesh underneath.
He doesn't have enough.
Right, he doesn't kill her. He just
it.
Makes like a horrifying flesh wound.
I mean, God, get the man a power drill or something. The hammer's no longer a good tool for him.
And in the end, there's and this is another way where I just compare it to the many movies that have followed in its footsteps. There's not really like some, she's not reaching the whole time for like a fucking like knife that's just out of sight and then like plunges it into the hitchhiker's side or something. She just somehow slips his grip finally and jumps out the window, which again just adds to that. This whole thing just feels too fucking real, And
that scene where she jumps out the window, I mean, that like, what else are you gonna fucking do? There's so many times in horror movies where I'm like, look, it's 2 stories. Either twist your ankle or die here. Just break through the glass. And she just does it. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this movie definitely repeatedly subverts that common complaint about people making stupid decisions in horror movies. Like Sally, at least, makes mostly smart decisions consistently through this movie and is pretty smart in her own survival.
I thought she was going to die. The whole time I thought she was going to die.
The first time I saw this, I did too.
And I was shocked when she actually survived at the end of the movie. Because, I mean, the opening scrawl tells you that her and her invalid brother got Texas Chainsaw massacred.
Oh, that's right. The scroll says she died, doesn't it?
It doesn't. I don't know if it says she died. I'd have to rewatch it. But it certainly doesn't sound good.
Sort of ambiguous.
Yeah.
Well, she gets away. I mean, Leatherface chases her into the sunrise. She gets in a truck. He's just sort of impotently swinging his big dick chainsaw around because she got away.
Here's the dumbest decision in this movie is that truck driver gets out of the truck. So a big like semi truck stops for Sally.
A cattle truck.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right. Stops for her on the road. So she runs from the house. Leatherface is chasing her. The hitchhiker is chasing her, and she's trying to flag down somebody to pick her up. Semi-truck stops. Driver gets out of the car because Leatherface has like chainsawed the side of his truck a little bit, and the truck driver. Wait, what happens to him?
They get back in. So the driver gets back into the cab. He pulls her back into the cab, but instead of taking off, they exit out the other side of the cab.
Right. And I don't know why they don't just take off, but whatever. Like, small note because Sally ends up getting away.
Because there's and then another truck comes and she gets in that one and gets away. So I don't really understand why that was there. I was like, oh, well, this makes thematic sense. She's leaving she escapes in a cattle truck or whatever. But then that's just kind of
that would be a really eerie ending. And if she escapes like the meat business and winds up just being, she thinks she doesn't, she just winds up becoming,
complicit
or slaughter or something,
or maybe she's not slaughtered, but I mean, do you just have a final image maybe of her in the cab of this cattle truck, happy that she's survived, and then you see all the cattle stuck in the back of the truck, but maybe too on the nose.
Maybe the driver's very attractive and she's about to become a cattle wife.
Yeah, maybe. A little farm babe.
Yeah.
One of the most satisfying, entertaining, hilarious, and also horrifyingly real moments in this movie is when the hitchhiker runs out in front of the truck and just gets unceremoniously just plastered, and you see him like under the tires. Like, that's another one of those moments where I'm just like processing it on multiple. My brain is just hitting my brain on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Great moment.
Well, she gets away and she's screaming and seeming like a wild mix of emotions. Terror, ecstasy, relief.
She definitely seems to be smiling at the end, even as she's like sobbing and screaming and laughing. Yeah.
And it's so disturbing. And like that whole final sequence, there's so many things in this movie that are burned into my mind. And that also haunted me as a kid, all this broad daylight stuff. I remember wandering around, farms in Newport with my friends in the hot summer and hearing like the cicadas mixed with like weird like power tool noises in the background and thinking like, oh God, like we're going to get Texas Chainsaw Massacred right now. Mm-hmm. And that ending especially has that feeling, just that the sunlight bleeding. I mean, it almost looks, everything looks like all the gorier because of when it was shot. I learned today that apparently everyone hated working on this movie except Tobe Hooper, apparently. It was hot. It was miserable. He didn't know, he didn't always know what he was doing. He was purposely trying to make people feel uncomfortable so it would show in their performances. Apparently that last shot of her driving with the truck and the screaming.
It's not the last shot.
Or not the last shot, but like the last we see of her. Apparently they had filmed it all and she thought she was finally done with this movie. And they called her back and said, we didn't get it. And she had to do it again. And she said, again, people like to embellish, especially looking back. But she said, that is not me acting. That is me being thrilled that I'm finally done working on this fucking thing.
Well, it's a great shot
works.
and a great
Beautiful.
performance. Yeah, it's just, definitely burns itself into your memory, as does, of course, the iconic final shot of Leatherface fucking swinging his chainsaw around, dancing as like a silhouette against the sunrise set. I don't know what it is.
Who knows at this point? It's such a delirious film.
I think it's sunrise. I get the sense that
because
the dinner and stuff has happened overnight.
I assume that like a normal nuclear family, they have supper around
at 4 a.m.,
7
5
o'clock.
a.m.
7 o'clock at night. You know what I love about Leatherface? He gets up and puts a tie on every day.
He also puts some makeup on for dinner, which is interesting.
Yeah. Oh, he gets draggier as the movies go on, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Such a great ending. Jesus Christ. And I mean, that shot of him is maybe 10 seconds or something, and then just hard cut to black. I just had the biggest smile on my face when I finished watching this and was just shaking my head like, God damn, that's a wild movie. It's still so good.
It's such an iconic shot that I could honestly see that being a car commercial being structured around that shot. Sally gets into a BMW and it would sell.
Well, we just saw that on this year's Super Bowl.
Oh, really?
They had a commercial where Sally gets in the truck and she's leaving, and then a Ford F-150 pulls up at the stoplight. And she gets out of that truck and into the Ford F-150.
What? Are you fucking kidding me?
What? That's wild.
I'm making this up.
Oh,
but
right. This year's Super Bowl. Yeah. Oh, I forgot about it.
God damn it! I bought that.
Amazing.
I almost feel like we should re-record that where we play along. Yeah. Oh yeah, we should do that.
No, but don't, because I'm saying I could almost see it happening in real life. And
it's
true.
Oh
well, it did just happen. You idiot! Didn't you watch the Super Bowl?
It's totally plausible. Yeah, good commitment to the bit, Chris. Yeah. Sorry we failed to play along.
That's okay. So
it was ill-timed.
But congratulations again to Bernie.
Yeah. So this movie came out after Deliverance. I thought about Deliverance several times watching this movie.
Naturally, yeah.
And where does this idea come from of if you go into rural America, you're going to find people who have bad intentions?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel, who wrote the movie, they're proud Texans. So, I don't think they're... For whatever reason, when Tobe Hooper, I think, had an office in L.A. at this point, I think he loves Texas, and I don't think he's trying to malign it in any way by making this movie. But it certainly doesn't make me want to drive through some of the more sparse parts of the state.
Well, and do we want to get into
Redneck horror? Joe Bob did actually.
No, that wasn't what I was going to say. Okay. Do we want to get into this movie's portrayal of the mentally handicapped? Because at least Leatherface, I think, is supposed to be mentally handicapped, right?
I don't know.
I don't know.
No?
Or the physically handicapped. There's some now kind of problematic stuff about that too. I don't really fucking care, actually. It's not about.
It's of its time.
I think it's enough to say that the reason for their derangement, it's not like Joker, which will be an Academy Award winner next week when it wins Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Movie of all time. It's not like Joker where it just like attributes this stuff to like specific mental illnesses or whatever. It attributes all their crime to the conditions of them growing up in this slaughterhouse culture.
Yeah, they grew up poor. They grew up in
I mean, it doesn't attribute it to anything really. Like it's all left so vague.
Well, I guess it's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
But again, like I said, I the way I interpret it is that the banality of slaughter that happens on a slaughter floor in an industrial, or if you want to look at it as a consumerist thing, through that process deranges people. And it does. I mean, it does. The people who work in slaughterhouses in real life have not only high incidences of workplace injury, but high instances of mental illness and PTSD and that kind of stuff. So
if there's one thing that actually does bother me or that I don't like about this movie, it's that there is, at least to me, a sense that Leatherface, at least, and possibly the hitchhiker as well, is supposed to have some sort of mental illness, and that's part of why you're supposed to find them scary or upsetting or
well, isn't
unsettling.
that true of many of the serial killers that this was inspired by, like Ed Gein? I mean,
yeah, I just don't know that it's handled in the most thoughtful way.
This is not a movie about that kind I know what you mean. I understand what you're saying, but like I feel like that's an unfair criticism of this movie. This movie is just about scaring the fuck out of you by any means possible, with some potential for social subtext in there. I didn't see Leatherface as a human. Even Leatherface,
maybe that's another part of the problematicness of it, is that it encourages you to see this nonverbal, sort of childish but adult-sized character as something less than human.
We're not talking about mental illness, but we're talking about mental development, I think, is what you're talking about.
Cognitively impaired.
Yeah.
Now we're really getting into lingo.
I don't know,
but that's a distinction, because obviously anytime you have a maniac in a movie, in a horror movie, no matter what they're doing, whether they're stalking the babysitter, whether they're locking people up and making them cut off their feet, whether they're doing anything, mental illness is going to be at play.
Or insanity. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah, I guess it's more cognitively impaired.
When we see a full-size man, a giant man behaving like a child, and maybe
Baby Huey sort of thing,
and we think maybe that's the reason for his evil. I see where it's a little problematic, and that's one of the reasons.
And it's certainly a trope in movies.
Certainly,
I don't really think it's a trope anymore. It's just, and again, it's not. Obviously, I love this movie. It's not something that bothers me that much, but it's still one of those things where it's like, this is one of those things that doesn't quite hold up.
Well, and as a practical matter, that's one of the reasons why I say Leatherface kind of gets overexposed to me, because you have all these just really unsettling visuals that are really handled with a deftness, even from the opening shots of the movie, where all we get are little flashes of flashlight light through casket openings onto the fingers of decomposing corpses, all this stuff that really puts you on edge. And then we have extended sequences of this apparently feeble-minded maniac wearing a mask, sitting around in broad daylight, giggling and dancing and doing whatever. I don't know. It doesn't play well with me. I don't get as scared. I'm not scared of that. That's not what I had in my mind when I saw the rotting corpses hanging out at the cemetery, or the room full of the bones and the feathers. Does
it feel less real to you?
Well, that's why I said it kind of felt like a young filmmaker. I think it does feel less real, and it feels like someone like, isn't this fucked up?
I could see that. Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like Tobe Hooper. I don't know. I think it's a little bit ridiculous to talk about this movie being problematic in its portrayal of mental illness, because we get so little information.
Cognitive impairment.
Whatever you want to say.
Course corrected our language.
Okay, well, I think that's really like picking nits at this point. This movie is not. Doesn't have a lot. It does not flesh out a lot of details. I was personally not offended by it and didn't even really think of it. Like, Leatherface is just like a very specific...
And if you weren't offended, then why should anyone else?
Leatherface is a very specific menace. I don't think this movie is like trying to say that, like, you better watch out for that guy that's not fully developed over there because he could kill you with a chainsaw. It's more about, like... I see this personally as a movie about a kid trying to impress his dad, and this family seems to have their own sort of fucked up idea of like what is socially appropriate. I don't even know if it necessarily has to do with cognitive impairment so much.
I don't know that it's, saying you should be afraid of the cognitively impaired, but I think it's playing on people's existing ignorance of and lack of knowledge of and perhaps fear of the cognitively impaired. And again, it's not something that ruins the movie for me. It's just something where I go, that feels a little weird now.
I don't know. I mean, he was inspired by an amalgam of serial killers who were all very unstable people. And I feel like he's like so cartoonishly just sort of unstable that I didn't really even see him as human. And I guess you could argue that's the problem.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think that route is kind of a...
And also, I think another thing is he seems more childlike once you introduce multiple patriarchs in the family who clearly have authority over him.
I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down in it because I hesitated to even bring it up, but it's still just something that definitely registered for me as I was watching the movie, and that I think it's worth discussing at least. And we did. Yeah. It's important to make sure that people are treated well, no matter who they are.
Well, I agree with that.
And speaking of treating yourself well, you know how well you would look in an Every Horror Movie on Netflix t-shirt? You need to go to everyhorrormovieonnetflix.com right now. We have t-shirts. They look beautiful. They can be had for a very affordable price. Go get one. Also follow us on social media. We're at AmonCast on all your socials, EHMONcast. And, worth plugging, once again, we're going to be at the Motor City Nightmares HorrorCon in Detroit this April.
It's in Novi.
Well, for our national and international listeners who may happen to not know the suburb of Detroit known as Novi.
Our national...
Shall I Google that?
Detroit is the earliest... Detroit is the easiest way to describe it.
Our national and international audience especially needs to understand that if someone says to you that they're from Detroit or they live in Detroit...
Be suspect.
Look at their driver's license. If it says Novi, if it says Royal Oak, if it says Monroe, if it says Dearborn, if it says Groseal, if it says...
do you think that's unique to Detroit?
Northville? Yes. Yes, I think it is, because I think that you can credibly say you're from Chicago if you live in Naperville or something, but I think if you, I think
never hear this happening in Southern California.
I think Metro Detroit is so culturally and economically stratified that Novi is not replaceable, is not a synonym for Detroit.
It's like living in New Jersey and saying you're from New York. Like it's... I don't know. I do feel like it's a problem that's very unique to Michigan. Anyway.
Well, much as you may hesitate to do so after hearing that extremely interesting tangent, we also encourage you to go on your podcast provider of choice and give us a 5-star review as well. Just show us how much you love us and show the rest of the world how much you love us so that they have even more reason to give us a listen.
All right, so it's been wonderful talking about this with the two of you. Been looking forward very much to this film dropping on Netflix and being able to discuss it.
It's good to have some... I'm glad this movie's on Netflix.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of classic horror films on Netflix. There's hardly even any movies from the 70s on Netflix.
Yeah, so are we spinning the wheel?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, well, it is time to break out that dusty old wheel of death.
The Giga Wheel, the new and improved electronic virtual wheel that has every horror movie on Netflix on it.
I think it's starting to achieve sentience already. When I walked in before,
knows how to fuck us up.
When I walked in before it greeted me by name, it was weird.
It hums, it blinks, it clicks, it clacks. It
opened my beer for me.
It has LEDs on it. It's tied into your smart devices, your smart speakers.
We got fucking Ultron over here.
Yeah, it's yeah. So
if only it had the voice of James Spader.
We'll work on that update. All right, let me bring this fucker up.
All right, Chris, give her a spin. There we go. That is fucking hypnotic.
It's opening a beer for me while it's doing this little randomized process as well.
Oh, yes. The Devil and Father Amorth. This is a William
Father
Friedkin,
what?
Father North. This is a William Friedkin documentary that I've been actually thinking about picking out for the show for a while, where he follows or films an allegedly real exorcism.
Wow. This sounds dope. I mean, William Friedkin and our second documentary.
If there's one guy you can trust to make non-fictional films about exorcism, it's William Friedkin.
Absolutely.
Apparently, he's a believer. So I am fascinated to see this, and it's also really short. So
dope.
Easy homework for us.
Exciting.
All right. Well, until next time, for every horror movie on Netflix, I'm Steven.
I'm Patrick.
And I'm Chris.
Don't get chainsawed.
Bye-bye.